Show us the money. It's episode 29 of For Our Edification. Thanks for joining us on this episode of For Our Edification, a podcast that unpacks how everyday stuff affects the value and identity of folks so that you can repack it for whatever your journey is. And you can find past episodes of For Our Edification at eddifrancis.com, also on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. The very lovely Dr. Halima Leak Francis is in the spot, third time in a row. Okay, say what's cracking. No, you gotta say what's cracking. Yeah, okay. Here's what's cracking. A USA Today article entitled How Funders, School Leaders Can Step Up to Combat Philanthropic Disparities Faced by HBCUs was run a few days ago. And we're going to talk about it. And guess what? This is the return. We're going to call this the return of the Right to Bear Arms segment. The views and opinions expressed on For Our Edification do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the hosts, guests, or any entities with which we are affiliated. May 27th. USA Today, they run an article, and it seemed primed to dive into ideas about addressing funding disparities between HBCUs and, interestingly enough, Ivy League institutions. And Halima, what happened was I took a look at this on Twitter, and I noticed that there was a president from an HBCU that tweeted something pretty interesting. He quoted a line of the article in his tweet, and he used it as evidence of why he is so active on social media. Now, the line was, HBCU leaders also need to be better about promoting their product through tools such as social media and podcasts, right? Here's the concern. The concern is that the article, the headline, I mean, you're thinking is going to be about looking at funding disparities. You're thinking it's going to do this dive in. But that line appeared in the second paragraph of the article. And so I was a little confused about it because I was thinking, I thought I was going to read a little bit more about the actual disparities themselves. So before we dive into this thing, there are a couple of things. All right. So first of all, I got to tell you this, Halima. A mutual friend of ours named Kyle, who seems to have a similar last name as mine, he was making fun of us because he said, wait, are you two doing a podcast on Zoom or on virtual meetings in the house?
Maybe.
So Kyle, you watching this, you mind your business. All right.
You mind the business that pays you and not philanthropic dollars. Don't worry about where I am.
But there are 3 points I want to make about this before we dive in. And I really want you to make this almost like your Right to Bear Arms philanthropic masterclass on higher ed funding. But the first thing is this. Number one, I want to be very clear that this is not an attack on the writer, is not an attack on the people who are quoted in the piece. It's an expansion. It's an expansion on this conversation through a little bit of analysis on the article. The second thing, for our edification, see what I did there? Hearing from a scholar and in higher education, we're hearing from someone who understands philanthropy and also organizational culture. So that's what we're doing here. And here's the third thing. At the end of the day, I really want the goal for this thing to be this. We have a lot of people who are aspiring HBCU leaders. There's some people who are saying, I am going to be an HBCU president, which is beautiful. It is my hope that they listen to this and they pick up ideas that can be translated into attainable goals, attainable fundraising goals, and philanthropic priorities when they become presidents or they take on leadership positions at their respective institutions. So I hope all of that is fair. So let me address the social media thing first, and I'm going to address this very quickly. Yes, social media is very helpful. There's no doubt about that. But the positioning in the article to me is kind of curious because I'm thinking that it may leave aspiring HBCU leaders to overestimate the importance of using social media in fundraising. I think it's important to keep in context that I'm looking at this article that's priming us to read about fundraising and philanthropy, and then social media comes up as part of a solution. And yeah, it can be great. It can be great. As a matter of fact, I'm going to shout out my old president, Walter Kimbrough, who pointed out that social media was very helpful for him when he was the president of Dillard. He leveraged the great podcast episode that he did with Malcolm Gladwell, at which point I was like, okay, it was Malcolm Gladwell's podcast. So yeah, you get on that podcast. I hope we get something out of it. But that opportunity doesn't come around every day. That's one that you got to really, really fight for. And the other thing is that, and I got to say this as someone who has sat in the seat of being a Marcom director at 3 HBCUs, when you put something out there like if folks can get on social media, if they can do stuff like podcasts, then yeah, that's going to be a really, really helpful thing in fundraising. What that does unwittingly is that it puts Marcom teams in the crosshairs of presidents, because I guarantee you anywhere between 10 and 20 presidents, as soon as they read this, they went to their Marcom directors, their vice presidents, their whoever they have, who are the chief marketing, chief communications officers. I guarantee you they went to them and said, we got to step up our social media game, and you better do it, and we better go viral. And I think that's unfair. I think that's a really unfair expectation to put on folks, especially when they have some other priorities that I'm sure are much more important than trying to make it lit and go viral on social media. And I'm happy to talk about that. So there are three points, Halima, that I want to point out before we jump into what your thoughts are. So the first one is that there was a study done by Candid in partnership with ABFE, and I can't remember what ABFE stands for.
Association of Black Foundation Executives.
Thank you so much. So one of those points was funding to HBCUs from large U.S. foundations fell 30% between 2002 and 2019, with the average Ivy League institution receiving 178 times more foundation funding than the average HBCU. Point number two that was brought up in the article, from 2015 to 2019, HBCUs received $303 million compared to a combined $5.5 billion to 8 Ivy League institutions in that same period. And the article pointed out 99 HBCUs, but I'm pretty sure there are more than 100 with this number. Only, you know, we talk about this all the time. The number just changes on a monthly basis. Number of HBCUs. But still, if you're talking about multiple compared to only 8, yeah, that's kind of jarring. And then the third point I want to bring up for reference is that HBCUs make up 3% of U.S. colleges and universities. However, HBCU grads tend to make $900,000 more than Black graduates of predominantly white institutions or Black workers without college degrees. So I bring up those data points because, first of all, there's that big gap. But then that last data point, I think, calls attention to the fact that the value is there when it comes to HBCUs. And I thought for this article, that was a perfect launch point to give more, to put more meat on the bone when it comes to talking about philanthropy and fundraising for HBCUs. So with all that stuff being said, and I'm going to shut up. First things first, you, dear lady, did a great dissertation that actually covered a lot of this stuff. And so talk about your dissertation, but then also, and I'm sure they're going to fold this into your dissertation description, but also fold into that your observations about, first of all, just to set the table for folks for their knowledge, how philanthropy works in general in society.
That's a lot. Thank you. And thank you, Eddie, for opening the door for this conversation. Because I think it compels us, the article compels us to look at a few issues with a level of intentionality that sometimes goes missing when we're looking at things like philanthropy, when we're looking at fundraising, when we're looking at representation, equity questions, all of those things. So I do think that the article presents us with that opportunity.
Yeah.
Um, my dissertation was on the Kresge HBCU initiative, and it was really focused on understanding the impact of the initiative some probably 10 years after the sunset or the conclusion of that initial body of work. So the Kresge HBCU initiative was a 5-year, $18 million program to really grow fundraising capacity at HBCUs, and the focus was on 5 institutions. For anybody who's watching, I recommend that you go review um, the report that was issued. Was called "Changing the Odds," and it maps out all of the elements of the initiative. But the focus was on one, providing funding, to training and technical training, providing training for HBCU leadership, for advancement staff or institutional advancement staff, and then 3, providing technical assistance and resources to make sure that the individuals who participated in the schools who were recipients or a part of this project or program were able to essentially grow their ability to raise money. Um, Now, my research, again, coming sometime after the end of the program, uh, really offered a chance to look at the long lasting impact, the enduring impact of um, the investment of the program, and also what lessons could we learn from the program. So through case studies, through that particular case study, that involved interviews. It also involved document review and some other levels of analysis. But I really began to see that the conversation around securing resources and philanthropy, particularly in the context of HBCUs, is much more complex than we typically give attention to. So I'm really happy that you mentioned the data point about AbbVie. Um, the Association of Black Foundation Executives, along with the work that they do, the research that they do, and the data that they collect, they do advocate for more representation of foundation executives who are Black, Black and Brown foundation executives to provide leadership in that space. So that's an important part of this conversation. So, who in the foundations are making the decisions? Another piece is access to foundation executives to build those relationships. The Kresge HBCU initiative was designed to build that access point or that capacity, because if you compare development staffs, or if you compare institutional advancement staffs to from HBCUs to peer institutions, not even bringing into the equation Ivy League institutions who have, in some cases, armies of people who are raising money, then there's a huge disparity there. Oftentimes at smaller institutions, or institutions that have been historically marginalized or under resourced, they have a development staff or fundraising team that may be one person, or on a good day, 4 people, who are focusing on functions such as individual giving, foundations, sometimes plan giving, annual fund, major gifts, all of the domains of private philanthropy, not to speak of other revenue generating opportunities within colleges and universities. So if we're going to talk disparity, we do have to talk about the disparity of capacity. It's not just a disparity of foundation funding, it's a disparity of capacity. And I think that the article gives us room to explore some of those issues as well. And these are also some of the things that I discussed in my research.
So one quick thing, if you could give an example of an actual number of the number of staff, support staff that an Ivy League institution may have versus a number of support staff in fundraising that an HBCU has, what does that look like?
So in contexts where I've worked, so and our institution, I've worked within spaces where institutional advancement would be made up of not only fundraising functions but marketing and communications functions. So they tend to be partnered together. So that's one thing, and is the function and the design of how they work together. In some institutions I've seen where I've worked, and these aren't Ivy League institutions. These are
Right.
perhaps elite institutions, um, usually private, with endowments in the neighborhood of $3 billion to $5 billion. Uh, for our annual fund alone, there would be about 7 people dedicated, and that's annual giving. When you get to major gifts, the major gifts team would sometimes be double that. So that's 14 people or so. So we're already at 21 people. Your communications team, you have somebody who's responsible, maybe 2 people responsible for digital marketing. You have somebody who's responsible for strategy. You have someone who's responsible for direct appeals, so the mail appeals that go out and those kinds of things. Again, staff of like at least 7 people to be wholly functional. And then
And
you
that
get
and
into
that's marketing, and that's marketing and communications just in development, not at the university level.
not at the university level.
Oh
So
Lord.
these
Okay.
people are they're responsible for development, marketing, and communications. And then the university communications are sometimes housed in a different space. So they're housed in a
Yeah.
different function within the university. They might be a part of that function, but they're engaged. They have very clear divisions of responsibility. So you'll have somebody who is focused on alumni communications versus someone who's focused on the appeals. They're not always the same people, but they support
That
one
must be
another.
nice.
They work together. So then that brings us to alumni affairs, right? So you have a different function for alumni affairs because your alumni are they're one of the major constituencies of the university. Their only priority and reason for engagement is not to give, but they certainly present a strong opportunity for fundraising.
And I ask you that question so that anybody who is watching this or listening to this can understand. Halima mentioned that there could be 7 people just in which area you said, which area of
Annual
development?
giving,
So there could
and
be
so
seven
annual
people in
giving,
annual giving. For comparison, where I have worked, there's been no more than 7 people for the entire institutional advancement operation. And maybe I don't know, what do we have at Dillard? We probably hit about 10 people, maybe throughout institutional advancement, maybe about 10 to 15, but that includes that includes development, alumni relations, and research and sponsor programs. And at
mhm,
one point, communications and marketing was in there. And then now it operates a little differently, but that is the entire operation. And I think I did mention alumni affairs being in there as well. So that is the
mhm.
entire operation. So just for annual giving, I mean, I think a lot of HBCUs might be lucky if they have one annual giving person, if they have one at all. It might be
Yeah,
somebody
if you have one
doubling
who's
as
dedicated, right? Somebody usually doubles.
yeah, somebody usually
So
doubles, and then you mentioned marketing and communications having a spot inside of the institutional advancement area. But where I've been, I had a staff of 5 people at Dillard. I was lucky to have that staff of 5 people, and we handled the entire university, including institutional advancement and the academic programs, and we
Mhm.
handled all of that. But when I was at 2 other places, I was a one-man
You were
show, and I
it.
was expected to handle everything for every single segment of the institution. So for comparison, I just really wanted people to hear the comparison of numbers right there.
As someone who teaches in public administration, so I lead a public administration program. Capacity and culture are two things that really usually when I'm looking at challenges, when I'm looking at how do we get to the next level, when we're analyzing um, deeply institutionalized problems or exploring great opportunities, the conversation always comes back to capacity. And then there's a quick second is the culture. So can we support this in the resources that we have? So we all have big dreams. We all want to, achieve whatever we achieve, but is it feasible without
Hmm.
is it feasible? Period. Um, and then, do we have an organizational culture that is conducive to supporting and sustaining what we do? So, do you have a culture that is that embraces risk, or can you afford to
Mm.
embrace risk? Do you
Mm.
have a culture of that embraces ongoing learning? So when mistakes are made, do you take a step back and assess where the system was broken and how we can fix the system and move forward with that knowledge? Are you a culture that you talk a lot, and I really appreciated this, employer branding? So how do you engage with your employees? Do you see opportunities to continue to grow your employees so that their skills are continued to be developed? I get calls from people who say, well, I was put in a job, or I got this new job, and I very quickly figured out that I didn't have the training or the expertise to do the job. And they were things that didn't come up necessarily in their resume, things that didn't come up in the interview, but a lot of these things were tied to culture. So I'm not used to leading people, so I don't really
Mm.
understand how to ask people or how to engage with my team. So these are all really, really important questions, and particularly when you start to get into development, because a lot of it is relational. It's even that more important to interrogate and to kind of to ask those questions.
Hmm. So, what about the role of philanthropy in society in general? I mean, what does that look like? Because I think a lot of folks, when they see this sort of thing, it was interesting to me in the article that there was so much focus on large foundations,
Mm.
and so I'm sitting here, knowing you because I've been sitting at the feet of the fundraising and philanthropy expert all this time, and I'm sitting here going, well, I wonder what Halima would think of this because they keep talking about foundations, so. So I mean, so talk about how philanthropy works
Yeah,
in society, especially the way you view philanthropy working in
yeah,
society.
yeah. So I view philanthropy as a tool for um, advancing the common good of society. A lot of times when people talk about philanthropy, they break it down to the Latin, and it's love for mankind or love for humanity, and that is certainly a part of it. It is a central part and an essential part to philanthropy. However, philanthropy has the ability to operate and work in some diverse ways, and beyond a moral um, a moral imperative. And I talk about oftentimes what we see in philanthropy is not always good. Like it's not always inherent, but it's subject to what the philanthropist's interpretation of good is, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if you have a donor who seeks to build a labor force, and this is one of the historical kind of narratives of philanthropy for HBCUs. If you have a donor who at a point in time has the ability, capacity, and a certain set of beliefs around developing a labor force or educating a group of people in a certain way, then their dollars are going to follow that mission, usually. So philanthropy has the ability to shape our society. Literally, it's an infusion of funding and resources that has the ability to provide hospitals and medical institutions and research, provide things like education. So very quickly, if you start to think about philanthropy in the framework of its societal shaping capacity, you really quickly start to see that many of the anchors of our society, many of the critical elements of our society, philanthropy has played a role in, whether it be testing out ideas, whether it be implementing things. The nature of philanthropy, it moves faster than a lot of other domains of public service and public administration. So if you look at it, oftentimes philanthropy is called the third sector. So if you look at it alongside government, corporate, and then philanthropy and nonprofits together with that, then you start to see that the movement of resources is a lot different. It's a lot more independent. It is in some ways a lot less regulated. So there are implications for all of that in terms of how philanthropy plays a role in shaping what we see. The best models and the models that I tend to appreciate, I don't want to say the best, but the ones I appreciate the most are the models where philanthropy can work as a partner, can work hand in hand, whether that's with the beneficiary or the recipient, or whether that's with other sectors and with other service domains. So philanthropy is a pretty powerful, beautiful, complex tool that can take on a lot of different characteristics. And, I talk about one of the things that really made me, and I hate to say like fall in love with philanthropy, but I do think I love philanthropy. Is thinking about the social justice capacity and opportunity within philanthropy. At different points in history, we've seen that when a change needs to be made, and the article references this in talking about the infusion of funding in the wake of the George Floyd murder. But
Mm-hmm.
philanthropy has the ability to change the tide. It has the ability to amplify and bring visibility to some issues that aren't always popular or aren't always given the attention that they deserve. So there's a tremendous amount of power in philanthropy, and I go back to the representation of foundation executives and the representation of philanthropic advisors, having people of color sit in those seats and having
Mm-hmm.
access to those tools and influencing that lever of change is critically important. Um, so that's I see a lot there within philanthropy.
You're listening to, or you're watching, for our edification. I'm Eddie. She's Halima. And just a couple of things to note, by the way. We do have a couple of episodes for our edification dedicated to philanthropy. So there's episode 8, which is Understanding Black Philanthropy. Two friends of yours, and you had a really, really cool conversation
Yeah.
in that episode. And then episode 11, understanding or having what does it mean to have a philanthropic identity? identity, which is yet another great conversation that that Halima led right there. And so I wanted people to get an idea of what exactly goes into all of this. So, all right, so let's talk about some another area where you are pretty well versed, and that is understanding higher education itself. Because and I don't mean to I don't mean to give the guy who wrote the article a hard time. Because I did look him up, and he actually writes a lot about diversity, equity, inclusion, and so this article seemed to really mean something to him to write it. But it's only an 800-word article about a pretty heavy topic and a pretty involved topic, and so I think a big piece of this is that I think people who don't understand higher education might have been left with the impression that there are only two ways for an institution to raise money: tuition and donations. Um, and so, what are other ways the colleges and universities, especially privates, what are other ways the colleges and universities make revenue, raise money?
Yeah. So one thing, and I'm glad you talk about the positioning of the article, because what it did for me, it made me curious to revisit research and areas, because my doctorate is in higher ed administration. So one thing that makes me do is really think about the contexts within that higher and post-secondary education institutions operate within. So things like historical context, social contexts, place, classifications, all those different domains. So this article, one thing that was interesting was that the comparison point was HBCUs and Ivy League institutions. Um, Not an apples to apples comparison for a lot of different reasons. But it nonetheless, I went directly to look at, it made me curious about particularly Harvard's financial
Mm-hmm.
report and financial sources. So I went to look at Harvard's financial report for 2022. Um, and I found some consistencies there in terms of revenue, but I also found some interesting points that I'll share in unpacking this thing, because we're packing and unpacking. So traditionally, revenue sources are, and this is for private institutions, tuition, philanthropy, in some cases, federal, state, and local appropriations. That tends not to be so much the case with privates, but it just depends on, again, the context and the environment that they're operating within. Um, Endowment revenue is another area. So people talk about endowment, and endowments are, they function for the long-term financial stability and sustainability of the institution. Endowments kick off revenue, typically somewhere in the 5 to 5.5%, where institutions can use the revenue for their operating expenses, right? So
Mm-hmm.
your endowment is important. You're not meant to spend it all, but
Yeah, I
you're
was
meant
about to
to.
say because there's some people think you can go to the endowment like it's the bank and you can just take some money out.
There's a difference between an endowment and a reserve fund. So reserve funds have a lot more fluidity in terms of how they can be spent. So just think about it in that context. Another area where there is opportunity, I think, for HBCUs, is in the area of research and other services and other things that they produce, such as publications. So there are other revenue generating areas. So foundations, very quickly, I mean, philanthropy broadly, yes, is a significant piece of the pie, but foundations, when you look at it, they're one of, five, perhaps six or seven revenue sources for institutions. And in my opinion, I do think that if we're looking at kind of stability of resources, philanthropy is pretty. It can be high risk,
Yeah.
because a lot of it varies, or there's change based on uh, being directly responsive to what's happening in society in this moment. And if you can't demonstrate a connection in your work to what's happening or what the concern of the philanthropist, foundation, or individual, what their concern is, then that edges you, or that creates a smaller window of opportunity. So to me, considering revenue sources of colleges and universities broadly, I think it is very risky to put all of your eggs in the tuition basket. And I think it's very risky to put all of your eggs, or the other eggs that you haven't put in the tuition basket, into the revenue basket.
Yeah, and
Now,
there was a professor from Howard who they quoted in the
mhm,
Robert Palmer, and he actually, when they talked about all the money that HBCUs raised during 2020 or after 2020, during the year of reckoning as we've been calling it, but he pointed that out. Palmer said it's about the moment. And
mhm,
so a
mhm.
lot of people ask during that time, okay, what's going to happen when this all wears off and people aren't feeling so, you know, people
And
aren't
you
feeling
see,
so, bad.
we're seeing counterattacks now. Like, we're seeing
Yep.
limitations on equity initiatives. We're seeing things that are directly intended to turn that clock backwards, where we're not even providing our students with access to knowledge around historical racial challenges, and racism, and all those other things. So that's as I think about this with my sociological lens, because my master's is in sociology of education. So when I think about this from that perspective, there is a counterbalance. So you may have philanthropy that is awarding millions of dollars in grants in funding, but on the other side, you have policy that is actively prohibiting the execution of that work. So
Mm-hmm.
you start to see kind of a push and pull, or a tug of war, that some schools are um, more subjected to than others. Again, a lot of this is qualified in within the context of publics and privates, but um, there there's a give and take in the philanthropic world, and it doesn't operate kind of independently of everything else. It is a lot more flexible, but um, it can be risky to put all of your eggs in that basket.
Right.
So for me, models that are a lot more broad and holistic, and diverse, because at any given time, like endowments, at one point in time when we were looking at the economic downturn, um, gosh, that was a while ago. It doesn't feel like that long ago, but everybody was saying, it's a liability to have a large endowment, and it was, because it's subject to
Mm-hmm.
market. Um, and then at that time, people were saying, you know what? Well, it's great that we have a large pool of annual fund donors. So as an institutional leader, taking a step back and not getting so, taking a step back and looking at your fiscal resources, your revenue, your projections for 5, 10, 20 years. So the legacy of the work that you do at the institution, looking at it from a fiscal sustainability lens, will very quickly pull you out of the conversation of being dependent
Mm-hmm.
on philanthropy and certain types of philanthropy. Um, Foundations are wonderful partners. They are wonderful partners, but I'm not an advocate. I'm not even an advocate of being dependent on individual donors. So relying on your alumni base is important. But what if something happens where you are producing a base of alumni who aren't able, well, producing a base of alumni who are facing recession and job loss, so you're not going to be able to fundraise from that same population the same way.
How do foundations and other funders measure the profile, reputation, and potential ROI when it comes to an institution that they might be looking to work with? And the other thing is that people they want to make this such a public conversation all the time, and it always turns into, well, the people have to see that we are working really hard to make them. And I'm like, no, you don't have to make it a public conversation. Move in silence, follow the Lil Wayne philosophy, be,
Be
be,
lasagna.
yeah, G's move in silence like lasagna. You don't have to tell everybody what
I
you
love
did. You don't have to tell
lasagna.
everybody you got a check. Not everybody needs to know you got
No,
a check,
no.
And so, yeah. So, but wait, what were you about to say?
So I was about to say that your perspective on media engagement and doing so in a thoughtful way. One thing I really appreciate about that is that you focus on analytics. So you like to bring analytics into the conversation. So if you start to kind of chart what the story that went viral, the impact that it stands to have, you get a peak of recognition, and you get a peak of maybe even an influx of funding. But the question is then, how do you keep the downside of that slope from happening? Because it's a peak
Yes.
and a valley, peak and valley, peak and valley.
Yeah.
So how do you create a shelf from
Mhm.
that peak? So you were here, and I'm doing really bad like demonstration of my quantitative data. People just close your eyes, don't even look at me. So you were here, you get this peak, and then the job is not to go back to here, but to use it to maybe get here. So you may not be here because
Mm.
this is a peak. So, but you do need to be higher than what your next lowest level was. So, how are you going to build on that story, or how are you going to build on that exposure in a strategic way? So, that story can become a way to open the door for visibility, but it shouldn't be your full visibility strategy.
It
So
shouldn't.
going
Yeah.
viral,
Yeah.
it, and and um, yeah, going viral is again high risk. And when I say risk, I'm thinking about it in terms of um, not only what it stands to produce, but how much control do you have over that? How
Hmm.
much can you predict? How much can you control? So risk isn't only we stand to get $50 billion, but risk is how much can you control the notice and the attention that your institution is going to get given the contexts of the market that it's operating in. So if you're thinking about a media market, our media market has a certain set of values or a certain set of things that are trending. You got to jump on the lead. You got to, engage in
Hmm.
the conversation that's happening right now. And how much of that is authentically beneficial to you as an institution? What conversations do you need to be in, and what conversations do you want to be in?
Right.
Um,
Right.
what is the media appetite for how it positions and treats certain types of institutions, particularly HBCUs? So there's tons of research that talks about media's predisposition to um, report the negativity of
Hmm.
HBCUs. So we hear about all of the accreditation losses. We hear about the shootings on campus. We hear about, there's a few check boxes that we tend to hear about with HBCUs and perhaps urban institutions. But if you do a media audit of HBCU coverage versus, and for the purpose of this article, Ivy League institution coverage, you're going to see very quickly that there is, again, an equity disparity in how institutions are represented. So given that environment, given the reality of that social construct and that environment, is media dependence your best strategy? And
No.
that's a question for you to answer, not you, Eddie,
Oh, I'm
but
sorry.
that's a question. I mean, and I'm an evidence based decision maker, so I want to know the evidence, and and if the answer is yes for you, then by all means do it. Like I think there's some institutions where media is uncharacteristically friendly, and they tend to be the ones where, and they, I don't have to name them, but they tend to be the ones that are always highlighted in ways, and that creates a different set of challenges. But is the media truly your friend, and what does it take to make the media your friend for some of these institutions? So or is
so,
is
so,
that the best use of your time?
so
Sorry.
no. So, but let me explain why, and I want to get back to your answer, but let me explain why. And this is an actual conversation that happened. I was asked about media exposure, media exposure, media exposure. How are you going to get us in the media? How are you going to get us in media? And my response was, I went to the university website and it is outdated.
Mm,
So you get your moment in the sun, you get your magical media story, you get billions of dollars worth of exposure, ad exposure out of this story, but your website is outdated. Did you really get what you needed out of it? And they might say, well, we got some donations, but did you get all the donations you could have gotten if said donor or donors or alumni or whoever had gone to the website and the website was updated, and the website was, it had the proper information that it needed? And so I frustrated a few people when I said, I want to get away from the media thirst trap. And what I would like to do is I would like to dig into the website, because people are constantly searching on the internet, constantly doing
mhm,
that. And I want to beef up our search engine optimization. I want to go in there.
mm,
I want to kill the metadata game. I want to get the tags right. I want to get the keywords right. I want to get in there, and I want to fill it all up, and I want to do a strategy. Not only that, I want to generate campus stories, and I
mhm,
want all those stories to live on our website. That way we
mm.
are always in control of our narrative. Always
Yes.
in control of the narrative,
Yeah.
and we're
Yeah.
not sitting there with our thumbs up our butts, waiting for people to come run to the campus with their cameras and say, "Oh, your university is the most wonderful thing we have ever seen in the history of higher education." And it's like, no, we need to say that we're the most wonderful thing in the history of higher education. We need to own that story. And there was a podcast I created, and people got so frustrated with me because they wanted to know how come the podcast didn't have thousands of downloads. And I said, here's the purpose of this podcast. And this is where
Mm,
I do agree with the article, but in a different way. My thing was, I want to create the podcast. I want to interview all of these faculty we got, our great, wonderful faculty. Give them the link. They can include it
mm,
in their grant packages. They can use that link however they need to do it. And that's how they can get their funding, or that's how they can get attention. Am I worried about getting thousands of downloads? No. What I'm worried about is making sure that we have something that highlights our services that we can send, like we make a direct pipeline to whoever those potential funders are. And that's more of a marketing strategy than it is a communication strategy. And
mm.
so I started
Yeah.
to really drift more in the marketing side of the house, which is more of a business function than the communication side of the house. And it really frustrated people because it wasn't fabulous. It wasn't lit. It wasn't going to set the world on fire and tell everybody our names. And I was sitting there like, everybody knows our names. They know. the name.
and
But you gotta use it wisely. That was my thing.
yeah,
All
yeah.
right,
I
I'm
think
done.
about,
Thank you.
I think, I think maximizing the usage of those tools. So,
Yeah,
when I was a chief philanthropy officer and, having been a director of development and alumni relations and um, just other engagement areas with philanthropy and funders, I use that kind of stuff as stewardship tools. So I
exactly.
can use. There was one place where I was where we used specific episodes of our podcast, and we would send it in the report that because you have to submit a report
Hmm.
to funders. Um, we put links to it in the report and use that as evidence and use that as a form of data, as narrative data, to demonstrate the impact of their funding. Every every intro outro to that podcast or on the website or somewhere, we know that we thank the funder. So they heard their name on the particular episodes, and that was part of our stewardship strategy. There's been other cases where I do agree with housing your story in your space as a strategy. And I disclaimer, out of all of the functions within, well, several of the functions within development, marketing, and communications has probably been the furthest away from from my work. But I have always built great relationships with my Marcom folk because they're the experts in this stuff, and I depend on them to help me strategize and figure out, okay, what's the best use of the resources and the tools that we have. So, if you're a Marcom
If you
person,
make if you make us mad, we have creative ways of forgetting the people who make us mad. So,
oh Lord, yes.
but if you love
Yes.
on us, oh my goodness, we will blow you up. So you
Yeah,
love on your
yeah.
Marcom people, love on them.
Thank, Thankfully, I have never crossed the path of a disgruntled Marcom person, but I've heard horror
But there was one
stories.
who had a
Anyway,
crush on you, and look at what he did.
you know what? It's in that episode. So, but being able to think creatively about how you engage in media exposure and to what end, and there are, when you talk about media, I mean, there's lots of domains of media. Like, you don't always have to
Mhm.
pursue like news coverage or
Right.
social
Right.
media exposure. There are times, and because colleges and so I'm not going to get in this, but colleges and universities, one of their primary functions is producing knowledge or making knowledge accessible. So there are times where you need to be represented in certain industry journals, or you need to be represented in media outlets that are curated a bit differently, that focus on what you do, and they're better positioned to highlight what you do. So I think it's both and,
Yeah.
but at the end of the day, take a holistic approach and be strategic about it.
Yeah.
The biggest waste of resources, and just the biggest waste of resources, the limited precious resources that your funders have invested in you, or your donors, or whoever, wherever you get your revenue from. One of the biggest wastes of those resources is to make some knee-jerk, trend-driven
Yeah.
decisions
Yeah.
that um, are not, they're impulse. They're impulse. And to be clear, there's a difference between being responsive and being impulse driven.
That's a big
So
difference.
recognize the distinction. Recognize the distinction. Um, so and that's a very long way of, of addressing your question, but I do think there is being thoughtful and being strategic about how you engage with media. The other thing I'll add, when you ask the question of how does this have to be a public conversation, I lean more, and this is probably the conservative part of Halima in, you know, um, under promise and over deliver, conservative part of my temperament, but I tend not to talk unless I got something to say or I really did something. So I'm not talking to announce that it's going to happen. I
Right.
try to, particularly so higher ed, when you're announcing changes in curriculum, when you're announcing things that are governed by other bodies that have to, give you approvals, and that kind of thing. So I tend to like to make a big splash once the accomplishment has been made. So once we've won, and then I can say we won, and this is the work that went into winning, or this is the work that went into this achievement. So I think being, again, strategic and judicious in and how and when you engage with the media, what platforms you're engaging on, who who gets access to what information, everything isn't meant to be public. I mean, it's just like, in your mama's house, your family. She said, I don't want to hear my business out in the street. And it's not a negative kind of thing of I'm trying to hide something, but it is being wise about how much you give, how much access you're giving people, and thereby how much control you're giving people to define the direction of your narrative and the value of your narrative.
But
So
that's my big thing though. My big question with that, and the reason I was asking you this is, do you have foundations? Do you have funders? Do you have people who are, you know, they really judge reputation, or they judge reliability, or do they get that sparkle in their eyes when they see either somebody they're funding or somebody they're thinking about funding? I mean, does it make that big a difference that people have to be in the media making all these announcements, doing all these things? Or is it more about these funders of these foundations saying, listen, just do the work, just get it done, because that's where the real ROI is for us. We want to see you produce, and we don't care whether you make an announcement about it. We just want to know that you're producing. I mean, how does that work?
So funders tend to want to make solid, sound investments. I've seen cases where funders, and when I say funders, I'm talking about foundations, where they have misjudged because they saw a media story that said something, amazing things are happening at this place, and they
Is it the
invested.
announcement that happens before the thing actually happens? Is it that kind? Is it misjudged because of that? Okay,
Sometimes, yes. So this is going to happen. It's an amazing place, and
I
and
hated
the
writing those
funder,
damn press releases. Y'all couldn't stand me. I'm just
and
like,
the
we haven't done it
funder,
yet. Why are we making such a big deal? I mean, it's like, can we write the press release when we do it? I'm sorry.
and
Go
then the
ahead.
funder calls. The funder follows up. If you have that relationship with the funder, and they're like, "Hey, I saw this article that you're about to do this great thing. How can we support it?" And nobody has a proposal ready. Like, nobody has, no, the project hasn't been conceptual. There's no concept. There ain't even a concept paper.
Right.
Forget a proposal with a budget that's fully fleshed out with an evaluation plan and all this. Because I'm like, sorry.
Well, no, but this is legitimate because again, I think one of the groups that's important to talk to is that aspiring HBCU leader.
Yes.
And I think it's important for that aspiring leader to understand what it means for the rubber to hit the road to get the funding. That's what I want that person to understand.
I want to come back to your question about funders' responsiveness, or how funders respond to media. media hits, and they you always want to see success from the places where you invest and where you support. But I do think that the relationships are a lot more. The one-on-one relationships with funders are a lot more valuable, a lot more predictable, and then again, things you can control. So I can't necessarily control what the program manager at X Foundation is reading. I can't control what they put in their Google alerts to give them a heads up on. What I can control is being able to communicate with them oftentimes. And a lot of times, and this is a practice that I developed, or just it was taught to me when I first started in fundraising, like decades ago. Not too many decades ago, but enough. Um, so reaching out to folk and asking if you can introduce yourself and talk to them. So I ask, first I introduce myself. I'm the blah 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 of the blah blah blah. Um, I saw your work at such and such, and I would like to learn more about your priorities and share news with you about some of the work that we're doing. When would be a good time for us to connect? So really easy door opener, and for me, I had a spreadsheet of foundations or donors that I was that I wanted to engage, and I used our research team. So again, if your development office doesn't have a research or prospect research arm, um, you're making your life very difficult. So I would use the research team to say, okay, well, these are prospects who might be, good sources. And then I would follow up with them because, when you send that initial outreach, someone may respond, they may not respond. You don't know what they have on their plate at the time. So I would put notes on my calendar to follow up with folk at a cadence that made sense to me. Sometimes it's 2 weeks, every 2 weeks. Sometimes it's monthly. Usually by the third time I get a response. And that has been the case for me when I'm trying to get speakers, when I'm trying to, in the higher profile, the higher, the busier the person may be, the more you may have to send that note. And then being understanding when they do respond to you, to say, hey, you know what, I'm so glad that you responded. I know you have a lot on your plate, so your time is valuable. And what you've done is you've started to build a relationship. And that person, as the representative of that fund, sees that operationally, this organization is more likely to follow through, or operationally, this organization takes a diligent approach to might take a diligent approach to the work that they do, because they see how you handle the initial part of the relationship. So I think that while media hits and media coverage will certainly give you that sparkle and splash, and give you that initial exposure, I always go back to relationships, and you know I'm pretty old school with how do we get our foot in the door, because you don't if you don't have access to the relationship, then it's hard to make the ask if you can't connect with the people. I also work to make sure that the work that I'm doing, or to make sure it's a good fit. So not every funding source or not every funder is going to be interested in the work that you do. I try to play matchmaker sometimes. And again, that goes back to it. So whenever they do develop an interest in what I'm doing, they'll remember that I connected them to another organization. And it grows your community. It grows the level of trust. I don't just cut people off and say, oh, well, you can't fund me, so I don't need to talk to. I don't need to waste my time anymore talking to you. I
Mm-hmm.
try to connect them with others because what's not coming to me, I want to share it with my community. So one of my colleagues or one of somebody I know in another organization, they may have programming that's a better match. So some of this goes back to just fundamentally like how you're treating your donors, and I think foundations, um, they pay attention to this, and if you another point of value for this is that some program managers at foundations stay at their organizations for years and years and years, and they progress into different roles in the organizations. If they don't stay, chances are they may go to another foundation. So you're either cultivating relationship with someone who may help you deepen your engagement and access to a specific foundation, or you're cultivating somebody who is in who's in the profession, and now they can advocate for you or be your champion or be your friend, um, in diverse spaces and in different places. So because they're all going to conferences, they're all talking to each other. They can say your name in rooms where you're not there. So I really, I again, another kind of Halima code is that I really put a lot of care into the relationships that I've developed with funders, and how I treat funders. Like, I don't just treat them as I need to get the check. I need to close this gift. And I know that there's an urgency that is throughout the field, where we operate from a space of crisis. Sometimes we operate from a space of lack, and that produces that desperation. But I think it's critical that we resist it, and we really um, are thoughtful and caring and compassionate about how we work together to create the change that we want to see. So yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the way forward.
Yes.
So the article mentioned a UNCF study, actually a really popular UNCF study,
Mhm.
that concluded that HBCUs consistently do more with less, punch above their weight, as UNCF puts it, and that's great. But I can tell you from having worked at three HBCUs that is also very stressful to have to constantly do more with less and to have to constantly punch above your weight class. It wears you down. It burns you out. And I, but I think that a lot of HBCUs can get some of the results that they want to get if they do so in a resourceful way. And so, what does that look like to you, for an institution that's under resourced to be able to work in a resourceful way to get the kinds of results that they want to get in funding?
So, foundational to that for me, or the counter question is, if we do more with less, if we consistently do more with less, what would it look like if we had more? So we could do more with more. We could protect the more that we've done with more. Um, Punching above your weight, if you think about athletes who constantly perform outside of their outside of their ability, or they're constantly putting stressors on their um, performance without building muscle or without building endurance, what's going to happen to that athlete? So beyond personal stress, beyond staff stress, because everybody doesn't value, like, everyone does not care about how, how
Right.
stressed you are. Like that, then that's a reality.
Mm-hmm.
But what could we do with more? And I think that compels us again to look at where we get our resources from, and how do we grow all of those areas. I regularly hear from people that what certain types of institutions don't do. So certain types of institutions don't do research. What if we did some research? What could happen? Is there, is there a rule in our governing bylaws that specifically prohibits us from doing research? If the answer is no, it's fair game. And people generate a lot of revenue off of research. So I think really looking at the things that you don't traditionally do and considering whether or not those are viable options for you in this moment in time, and if not, when. So do we want to have a 20-year plan or strategic plan that's going to get us to the space where we can do some of the things that we characteristically say we don't do well. What is it going to take to get us there? I think another thing that we can do in the terms of resources is invest in people. So I believe in professional development. I believe in growing once I find good people, investing and growing those people. I also believe in being pretty intentional about trying to position people in roles where they want to thrive and where where they have true interest and where they have true ability. I don't like to set people up for failure for karmic reasons, but it's just it's an expensive practice. So when you're not investing, think about and there's a data point somewhere that talks about the cost of, and you've mentioned this as well, Eddie, the cost of hiring a new employee versus the cost of growing talent internally or advancing an employee. And a lot of times people are like, well, we spend X amount of dollars in hiring a new employee. And one element they always leave out is the search process. The search process can be the most, depending on the position, it can be the most expensive part of the process in time and money. So quantifying and being very clear on, okay, I have this person who they may not excel in this area, but are there other things, other places I can put them? Because when they leave, they take that institutional knowledge with them. They take so much with them that you've invested in them. And I would argue probably for every year that person has been there, you're losing something upon their departure. So, how do you truly invest in your people and making sure that they have the knowledge and the tools and the environment that they need to succeed? The other thing I'll say is think about how you position yourself as an institution. So positioning is and how you position yourself as a leader. So I'm big on for institutional leaders, executive leadership, presidents, deans, provosts, whatever whatever the position is, and being clear on what your purpose and what your mission is for the work that you're engaging in. So not only, you started the conversation with saying, with talking about people who are aspiring to be HBCU leaders and perhaps presidents. Why? Why do you want to do that? And if the answer is simply because I just want to be a HBCU president, I think you need to spend some more time thinking about it, and think about the change that you want to. Seriously, I think you need to sit down and think about what you want to produce, what you want your legacy to be, and the lineage of leadership, because the school didn't start with you, it's not going to end with you. So what is your legacy in the lineage of leaderships and the identity of this institution? And what are you bringing to the legacy? Is it that you want to position or to be a part of positioning the institution as in their scholarly endeavors. So do you want to elevate the visibility of faculty research and what faculty produce? Do you want to elevate the what students bring to the community or your student community? Do you want to elevate the community impact of the institution? I really appreciate Jelani Favors' Shelter in a Time of Storm, because he talked about the impact of HBCUs in the civil rights movement. And that, to me, I mean, there have been conversations about the anchor impact of colleges and universities and HBCUs. But that, to me, pushes the conversation of how HBCUs position themselves. No, is not every HBCU is going to be this kind of community anchor, or be a community anchor in the senses that it's typically talked about. But it's something to explore. So think intentionally about how the institution is positioned.
Well, thank you, Halima. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us on this episode of For Our Edification. Make sure you check out the past episodes at eddiefrancis.com, on YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to download, give feedback, and share. Halima, you see, this is why everybody thinks you are just the bomb, the busy bomb. This is exactly why.
I am. Think.
I'm Eddie Francis. I'm Eddie Francis, and she is
Halima Leak Francis, and I use she and her pronouns.
Thank you so much for joining us on For Our Edification.